Thank you for your interest here at North Hills, where we are more than Sunday. If you have any questions or would like to know more about our ministries, you can always visit us online at north-hills.org. Now join us as Pastor James delivers his message.
Well, good morning. So we are in this sermon series called Hello, My Name Is. And for the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about our identities. And we've been talking about places that we find our identity. And we've been looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And that beginning of that passage really starts with our fleshly identities and how we should no longer regard people according to the flesh. And we've begun to strip away some of those things that people commonly place their identity in. If you remember week 1, we talked about our birth and how we're born nameless. And many of us, we find our identity in things that really we have no control over. We find our identity in where we were born, our parents, our race that we were born into, our religion that we were born into. We find our identity in the expectations that are put on us at birth. And we begin to have that identity that's placed on us, and we have to begin to move away from our identity at birth. Not that these things are a bad thing, but there's a bigger identity that we have to strive for, and we have to let go of the birth. Then we remember last week we got into our experience. We talked about how many times the things that we do in life give us our identity, our experiences, whether good or bad, whether our successes or our failures. We find our identity in our jobs. We find our identity in abilities or talents. But these aren't our identity either. Now we're moving towards this crisis. We're moving towards a crisis because what happens when we strip away these things that we hold tightly to? Hold tightly to our birth, our origin. Hold tightly to our experiences. We're moving towards a crisis, and we're beginning to ask, okay, now what? You've stripped away these identities. You better replace them with something. I'd be happy to. We're moving towards this identity crisis. And the question becomes, when you face an identity crisis, when your identity is challenged and somebody steps up and really begins to press, who are you really? How will you respond? What will you do when your identity is challenged? We've been in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verses 16, and we remember this man Paul. Paul grew up a certain way. At his birth, Paul was a Jew. He was a Pharisee. He was born into this culture that says you have to be a certain way, you have to act a certain way, you have to live a certain way, or God will not accept you. And carry that over, if you don't live this way, then your people won't accept you. And Paul was brought into this world of this Pharisee. And then as Paul got older, Paul began to find his identity in his experiences. Not only was Paul a Jewish man, but he also turned out to be a pretty good Pharisee. People really respected him. They really liked him. They thought he was a great person. He was a great teacher of the law. He was skilled in memorizing all of the laws and had a pretty good way of measuring up to people's expectations. And people thought, this guy is going somewhere. But as we'll remember, this crisis happened in Paul's life. You see, Paul was going on the road to Damascus. He thought he was doing God's work. He thought he was being this good guy who's chasing down those people that are affront to God, that God hated. And he's like, I've got to do this. I got to take these people and do whatever I can to stop them. And all of a sudden, God and Jesus knocks him off his high horse, blinds him, and sends him into a 3-day cocoon where he's got to figure out, all right, everything I believed about myself was wrong. Everything I believed about my experiences was wrong. I don't want to be that person anymore, but the question then is, who is he going to be? And Paul became, from that moment on, one of the greatest missionary voices the world has ever seen. Took the gospel all over the known world at that time. Made a lot of enemies. He gave up his family. He gave up his experiences. He put it all behind him for the sake of following Jesus. Your identity crisis causes you to make some hard choices. 2 Corinthians 5, chapter 16, Paul tells us, "From now on, therefore, we regard no one according to the flesh. Even though we once regarded Christ according to the flesh, we regard him thus no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. All this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ. God making his appeal through us, we implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." If you remember, we're looking at this image of a butterfly and how a butterfly starts out just as an egg on a leaf. Most of those little eggs won't even become caterpillars. They'll get eaten by something else. But that's how they all start. Same nameless identity. But then a couple make it to be a caterpillar. And caterpillars just eat. That's all they do is eat. And they spend their lives eating. And eating and eating and eating and growing and growing and growing. But I wonder if I could think about the way a caterpillar thinks. What happens to a caterpillar at that point in its life cycle that makes it maybe question? I don't know, does a caterpillar think about questions like, who am I? Is this all that life has to offer? Is it all about eating and growing? Is this really it? No, we don't know, but for whatever reason, a caterpillar makes a choice and then goes into this cocoon. It's called a chrysalis, where it wraps itself up, and over the course of a few days, it begins to change. It begins to have this transformation. And it's in there, and it's transforming. And one of the things that I found out about this cocoon, this chrysalis, is that in that chrysalis, the caterpillar actually dies. Kind of a weird thing. It actually completely dissolves, and only after it completely dissolves can it form into a butterfly. It's these moments of crisis. It's these moments of crisis where we go into this chrysalis of our own, and we really begin to question, who am I? What is life all about? Who am I now? Who was I? But most importantly, who am I going to be? Who am I going to be after this crisis is over? And our big idea for today is really simple. In a moment of identity crisis, we have to let go to move forward. In those times of crisis where we have to let go of the past, we have to let go of those things like how we were born, those experiences that we've had. In order for us to move forward into who we were meant to be, we have to let go of the past. And we have to let go of those past identities. One of my favorite movies one of my favorite movie series is The Lord of the Rings. And my favorite character in Lord of the Rings is a guy by the name of Strider. And you meet him pretty early on in the movies, and there's something strange about him. He's different. there's something more to him. And as the story goes on, we begin to realize that he has a past. He has a past that he's been running from. He has a past that he's been shunning. You see, his true identity is not who he makes himself out to be. His true identity is something far greater, but he's afraid to embrace the future. And he keeps holding on to a past that doesn't have to be. And he comes to this point of crisis where he has to make a decision. And in order to make the decision that will help him move forward, he has to let go of the past. Let's take a look at this clip. Put aside the ranger, become who you were born to be. Now, I love that picture because it shows us that in order for us to become who we were born to be, we have to let go of the past. At some point, we all have an identity crisis, and we do have to let go of the past in order to move forward. What I find interesting is I don't know if some of you have read the book, The Lord of the Rings. This storyline of Aragorn's identity crisis was not in the books. In fact, he always knew who he was going to be. He always knew he was just waiting and biding his time. So why did they add this idea of an identity crisis to him in the movies? And here's the reason why I think they did. Is that we can identify with somebody who has an identity crisis. We can identify with somebody who has a progression of change in their life. And I think in order for us to identify with Aragorn a little bit more, they added this to him. Hollywood likes to do this kind of thing where they add a crisis in somebody's lives because it helps us to identify and put ourselves in the shoes of that person. Because the reality is that all of us have at some point in our lives some sort of identity crisis. Sometimes it happens really early in life. Sometimes it's a little later. Maybe it's when we're deciding what we want to be when we grow up. Maybe it's deciding where we want to live, who we want to marry. Maybe it's us deciding to turn our backs on a past and a life that caused us to stay in sin. And we want to move forward out of that. But in order for us, in those moments of crisis, we have to let go of the past in order to embrace the future. And Paul tells us that this is a very fleshly way of looking at life. That this is a very worldly way of looking at life, is that we look at things like our birth. We look at things like our experiences. And we have that identity crisis. When we have that crisis, it forces us to decide. The world's like, why choose? Why choose between the past and the future? Just have it both ways. But that's not possible, particularly when it comes to following Jesus. And we'll get to that in a minute. We regard no one according to the flesh. We have to let go of the past in order to embrace the future. And some of us, I think, we've had those experiences. We know that's true. But then we make the choice that we're here. We're in the past. We have that crisis. We go into our chrysalis and our cocoon, and we work it out, and then we choose to go forward. But why is it that the baggage of the past continues to keep holding us back? Why is it that we think that we've changed, and we have changed? Why do we still struggle with those things? Well, the default is to hold on. The default for us is to hold on to our past. It's to hold on to those things that gave us our identity. Those strong, powerful things that defined who we were. It's to hold on to it. It's to resist any change. It's why we don't like criticism very well, because criticism is one of those things, and I mean criticism when it's for your good. When somebody comes to you, has a genuine concern, and says, I really think you need to stop this, or it's going to hold you back moving forward. We want to get defensive. We want to hold on to it, say, no, that's not a problem. It's one of the reasons why addicts will fight to the end saying, I'm not addicted. I have mastery over this. I can conquer it whenever I want to. We say things like, I'm not addicted to binge watching TV shows. I can stop whenever I want. 17th episode of the day. But think about other things, more detrimental things, like drugs and alcohol, like pornography. These things that we claim they don't have a hold on me, but they do. And the first thing that we can do is say, yeah, I get it. I have a problem. When you identify that problem, then you can leave it in behind you. But our default is to resist change. So what is going to cause us in those moments of crisis to change, to move forward out of the past? And it's going to take a transformation. It's going to take a change in each one of us. The story of the caterpillar is always, it's a beautiful picture of what it means to follow Jesus. You start as the egg, you grow into the caterpillar. But there is something that happens to a caterpillar in its biology that causes it to go into the chrysalis. You see, we think of a caterpillar becoming a chrysalis as the outside. It wraps itself up in this chrysalis and then it becomes a butterfly, but the chrysalis begins on the inside. The chrysalis begins as there's these uncomfortable formations or masses that begin to form on the inside of this caterpillar. Becomes uncomfortable, it makes it difficult for it to continue moving in the way that it's moving. And then as it begins to form those chrysalis things on the inside, it causes this outward transformation. Now, for those of us who follow Jesus, we talk a lot about baptism. And baptism is a very important picture of what it means to give your life over to Jesus. When we talk about baptism, we're actually going to be having a baptism in a couple weeks. But baptism is this picture, it's a symbol, an outward symbol that identifies ourselves with Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. But it's an outward symbol of this inward change. And the same thing with a caterpillar. It begins to have an inward change that manifests itself as an outward transformation. For the caterpillar, when it has that inward transformation, it doesn't have a choice but to change. In fact, if it doesn't change, it's going to die. That's the reality. If it doesn't change, if it doesn't transform, if it doesn't become the chrysalis, it will die. It has to change. Which brings us to our third and final point, is that crisis ultimately can bring clarity and growth, but only if you let it. You see, when you realize that you're meant to be a butterfly, when you realize you are meant for something so much more, think about Aragorn, when you realize that he is meant to be the king, how ridiculous would it be for him to continue to just be this ranger? Yeah, sure, that's a great life. He can do a lot of good. He can lead armies. He can do a lot. But he will never be who he was meant to be until he embraces who he was born to be. And each one of us, in a very real sense, is meant to be so much more. A butterfly, if you will. We're meant to fly. How ridiculous would it be for us to remain a caterpillar? Why crawl from place to place when you can fly? And I wonder sometimes, even after the butterfly comes out of the chrysalis, does it ever go back to its caterpillar buddies and just walk around on the ground? Does it ever spend time amongst them saying, hey, I think it's time that you became a butterfly? Does it ever convince its friends? But to me, it seems like to go from a caterpillar to a butterfly would be a scary thing. I don't know how much a caterpillar thinks. But as a human, projecting my fear on a caterpillar, I think that would be terrifying. And for followers of Jesus, I think it is terrifying. When you have that identity crisis, when you realize there is something so much more than just living life, finding my identity in my birth, finding my identity in the expectations of others, finding my identity in who my parents were, who my parents wanted me to be, finding my identity in my parents' God, not quite making it my own. And then you live a little life, you get some experience, and you get further along and you go to school and you figure out, this is what I want to do with my life. And then you spend so much time and energy pouring into education. You spend so much time pouring energy into trying to better yourself, only to one day wake up and God says, that's not what I have for you at all. Just to tell you a little bit about my story, I never, ever, 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 ever wanted to be a pastor. I wanted to be a lawyer. There's a big difference there, I know. I wanted to be a lawyer. I went to college pre-law. I studied political science. I applied to law school. I had my direction set. That's where I wanted to go. But then God intervened. God intervened and said, no, James, this is not the life that I want for you. Is there anything wrong with being a lawyer? I'll let you decide that for yourself. I don't think there is. Lawyers do a lot of good work. I know we have some lawyers in the church. I would have been a great lawyer, but that's not the plan that God had for me. And for me to continue on that plan, had God not wanted me there, would only have ended in pain, would only have ended in more of a bigger identity crisis down the road. Because we have to be careful with the plans that we make. We have to be careful how hard we hold on to those plans. Because the harder we hold on to our own plans, the more painful it is when God changes our direction. Crisis can bring clarity and growth if you let it. So what happens in our lives when we have this identity crisis? What happens when we have this identity crisis and we choose to move forward? 2 Corinthians 5:17. It says, the old has passed away. Now, a lot of times the Bible talks about things in the past that are still going on. It's kind of like that the end times has come. Are we living in the end times? Yes, we're living in the end times. Have the end times come? No, not yet. It's kind of the already, not yet. So really what I think is happening here is probably a good way to look at this would be to say, while the old in God's eyes has passed away, you're a new creation. As we experience it, it's really continually passing away. So the old is passing away, and the new has come. So why do we still struggle with the things of the past? There's this old Cherokee proverb that speaks to this. Now, growing up, I was always told that my grandfather's mother was full-blooded Cherokee. And I remember growing up, I actually heard this proverb from time to time. And it's not a Christian proverb, but you'll see that it has a lot of Christian principles. It says, an old Cherokee is teaching his grandson about life. The grandson says, a fight is going on inside of me. He says, it is a great, terrible fight and is between two wolves. One is evil. He's angry, envy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego. He continued, the other is good. He's joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith. The same fight is going on inside of you and inside of every other person too. The grandson thought about it for a minute, and then he asked his grandfather, Which wolf will win? The old Cherokee simply replied, the one that you feed. You see, the old is passing away, and we still have those struggles. We still have those things that try to keep us captive to our old identities. So how do we move beyond that? We start feeding our new identity. And this is where we move. This is the identity crisis that Paul had, where he had to make a decision between holding on to the life as a well-respected, probably very wealthy Jewish man who was a Pharisee, and this new life, this life that Christ is calling him to. Could he do both? Could he be a closet Christian that kind of tries to reform things from the inside? Is that possible? Can you just kind of be quiet, change inwardly, but slowly reveal your Christian craziness over time? Paul made a dramatic transformation. He couldn't stay. And he kept moving forward. He kept moving, and it cost him everything. His family probably disowned him. When we think about that, many of us in our Christian culture in this country, most of us will never have to make the choice to follow Jesus between following Jesus and our families. Many of us were raised in Christian homes. We, at a time said a Christian prayer. We got baptized and our families celebrated. But think about people around the world who come to this identity crisis and are like, following Jesus, getting stoned or beheaded in the street. How many of us want to make that decision? But in places like China, in places like the Middle East, that's a very real reality. And we as a church have a responsibility to take those people, those widows and those orphans. In many cases, those widows and orphans are not widows and orphans for any reason other than the fact that they chose to follow Jesus. Can the church be a place for those widows and orphans? We have this identity crisis, and we have to make a choice between following Jesus, our identity in Jesus, this child of the one true King mentality. And then we have to make a choice between everything else we found our identity in. Everything else, from our birth, where we were born, who we were born to, our religion, all of that, our experiences, all of that. Now it's just simply a yes or no question. And what I find interesting is that for many people around the world who choose to follow Jesus at the cost of their own lives, it's never really a question. The transformation that happens in them is so strong they cannot deny it. Yet we still struggle with it. So today, as we begin to ask that question, what does it mean to follow Jesus? I recognize that there are people in this room who still have not made that full transformation, have not followed Jesus. What does it mean to follow Jesus? What is that after the cocoon? And let me just tell you that not every chrysalis will live to be a cocoon or will live to be a butterfly. Not every chrysalis will develop into a butterfly. I visited a butterfly habitat. I think it was down in San Jose. Took my daughters to it. And they had these chrysalises, and a lot of them were just black because they didn't survive the transformation. But the ones that do, who become butterflies, what does it mean to be a butterfly? What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? Well, that's next week's sermon. For now, we need to make a decision on whether or not that's the direction that we already have gone or whether or not we want to go. Jesus tells us repeatedly in scriptures that following him is not easy. In fact, it seems though in scripture that he spends a lot of time trying to convince people not to follow him. I'll give you just a perfect example here. Luke chapter 15. If you go to Luke chapter 15, verses 16 through 27. It says, and he was looking, 15, maybe it was 16. I don't know where it is. Just be honest, when you're making your notes, you put it down and it just kind of comes up and it's like, oh, that's not the passage that I'm supposed to be reading. But the story comes up in these people, they say, Jesus, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus says, foxes have holes, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. If you want to follow me, I'm homeless. I go wherever I go. Somebody else comes up to him and says, Jesus, I'll follow you wherever you go, but please first let me bury my father. And Jesus says, let the dead bury their own dead. As for you, follow me. To follow Jesus is not supposed to be easy. To follow Jesus is about more than just what you do. Following Jesus is about identity. Following Jesus is about who you see yourself as. A lot of people came to Jesus for what they thought they could get from him. Jesus promises nothing. No wealth, no fortunes. In fact, sometimes Jesus does not promise safety. He does not promise that your life will be cushy. And believe me, you listen to a lot of preachers on TV and they'll tell you that if you give your life to Jesus, your life is going to be great, you're going to be healthy, wealthy, and prosperous. It doesn't take us very long to realize that's not promised. But what Jesus does promise us is one thing and one thing only, that our identity will become a child of the King, and that we will be co-heirs with him for eternity. That's what it means to follow Jesus. The question is that enough for us? Is that enough for us? As we enter into our time of reflection, we come to this question: when have you experienced an identity crisis? Maybe you're going through it right now. And you have another name tag to put on our board. And as you think about this, when's the time you had an identity crisis? What did you come out of? And as I was thinking about some of the things that we could talk about, we have the story of Aragorn. He was a ranger who became a king. For many of us who know when Paul's talking about this idea of let no one look at people according to the flesh, regard no one according to the flesh anymore. There's only two ways that you look at people now. In your entire life, as you come across people, the main ways you look at people are one, are they lost or are they found? Are we lost or are we found? Don't worry about are they a good person. Don't worry about are they a good worker. Don't worry about are they talented. Do they know Jesus or do they not? For me, as I think about this, the big transformation that happens in my life, and I think maybe some of you young people, or maybe not so young, can begin to identify with. For me, the biggest identity crisis that I'm struggling with right now is the transformation from child to adult. I think I've talked about this from time to time on Sunday mornings, is that 34 years old, When I was 18, 34 was old, but now as I'm 34, I'm realizing I still am very young, still very inexperienced, still have a lot of growing to do. But I don't feel like there was ever a point in my life where I had somebody come up to me and say, James, you're an adult now. It's time to put aside childish things. That's my struggle. My question is, what is yours? So as we go into this time of reflection, maybe on the name tag you put that transformation that you started at. Maybe it's adult, child. Maybe it's you went from being a great student to something more. Maybe it's your job to finding your identity in Christ. Or maybe right now you're struggling with that and you're stuck in the past and you want to write down where you're stuck. Maybe it's an addiction. Maybe it's just an attitude. Maybe it's a regret. Maybe it's a failure. Maybe it's a success. And you think you're pretty good. But it's time to let go of the past. This is all about the past. What are those things that still hold you there? And are you willing to let them go for the sake of the future? So as we go into this time of reflection, come on up as you feel led. Put your sticker on about something in the past that it's time to let go of.